appointments, the new Attorney General, and a feature that is always there. There's always a feature-length story, sometimes more than one, and there's always an interview, so questions and answers with an expert in the sphere, a lawyer, a human rights activist. So this. We have this concentrated information pill, if you might put it that, if I may put it that way, for those who want to get a sense quickly in like an hour of what's happening in terms of the investigation of Russian war crimes in Ukraine. Ruslan Topolevskyi represents the Center for Legal and Political Studies. Perhaps you could bring in a different viewpoint into our conversation on the documenting of war crimes, because obviously when a journalist is looking at a war crime and when a human rights activist is looking at a war crime whose job is to document the information, they might be different viewpoints. What objectives do you set yourself and your colleagues? Thank you. Well, with the start of the full-scale invasion after February 24th, the advocacy organizations joined into an initiative called Tribunal for Putin, and this is the Ukrainian Helsinki group, the Kharkiv Human Rights Group, the Center for Civil Freedoms, and a number of other NGOs. And the goal was to document the war crimes perpetrated by the Russian forces. The thing is that essentially the war is happening online. We see war crimes online. This is something that we probably didn't have in previous armed conflicts, because usually in investigating war crimes took place after the fact, after either the hot phase of the war was over or hostilities were over. We see this online now. We in 150 days, by the end of July, we note almost 10,000 shellings and attacks, and strikes. We've seen over 14,000 shellings of different buildings, including what we might call humanitarian infrastructure, humanitarian buildings, churches, schools, etc. But the question is that, taking note of these, all of this is happening in real time, and obviously we can't cover everything. So this is a question for everyone, or to whoever is best suited to answer it. If we come back to the work of journalists and Ukrainian journalists in illuminating this war, covering this war, to what extent are the Ukrainian media managing this task? If I may, so first of all, we see what's happening with the media market in Ukraine. Most of the TV channels were joined into the TV marathon, but I can't say that that is informing, that is information, that is coverage. Perhaps it motivates Ukrainians, perhaps it brings them together, but in my opinion, this single marathon, single news, it's far too optimistic, which brings the viewers creates a false positive impression in the viewers, because it's clear that the war is here for a while. The war is hard and difficult, and the people have to prepare for a difficult winter and for challenges and trials, and that perhaps that there will be more attempts to attack these. Therefore, do you see journalism beyond the marathon? Of course, there's journalism beyond the marathon. Apart from the fact that I work with IW. PR, I also lead Espresso channel. You know what happened to the Espresso TV channel? It was essentially its license was essentially taken away, but it continues to report on the satellite and on the internet, and it keeps working. Moreover, there are online media that fortunately remain free and professional, and the main thing for me is there's not just Ukrainian journalism, but it's the fact that Ukraine is open to international journalists, and over 3,000 international journalists are working in Ukraine, both along the contact line and in the rear, and provide a picture of the situation in Ukraine. This is our adventure. Are there other observations of how the Ukrainian media are managing their work? I'd like to add that yes, for Ukrainian media people, the events that happened is of course a challenge, but I think they're facing this challenge fairly well. And even in spite of the fact that Ukraine is a relatively democratic society, there are many situations that have to do with access to information are extremely over controlled. If you have to verify certain facts, particularly if you see if you need speed to verify or deny something, the all of this this is very difficult due to the system that you of official permits, um, which of course is that stands in the way of good journalism. Now we can't do anything with this in this time, but this is a challenge. Also, many Ukrainian journalists work as fixers or help international teams. For them, this is also a higher risk because often they work in the contact line close to the hostilities in recently liberated territories, but they're working uh, for the reputation and image of international media, although they put a lot of efforts, including professional efforts. Uh, and so Ukrainian journalism seems to remain outside, just out of shot, although the work continues. I just wanted to add, sorry, about the Akhmetov's TV channels. You know that the entire TV group has been closed down and 4,000 journalists have remained without work. They will be given termination pay, but they remain outside of the profession right now. And another problem is the full collapse of local journalism. Obviously, that in occupied territory there can be no journalism. Local people leave, but in free territories or recently liberated territories, we also have difficult economic situation. There's logistical difficulties. It's hard to pay salaries, so we see more and more local media simply closing down. With all that, objectively, there's probably also great opportunities for journalism, and we don't have a system of censorship. We don't have the professional journalist um, continues to have an almost unlimited scope for work. Unfortunately, the geography of the war is such that it lets many Ukrainian journalism continue work. Of course, this doesn't pertain to those who find themselves in occupied territories and are the target for Russian occupiers. But for most people in the journalistic profession, still have those opportunities. To what extent are they making use of those opportunities? Is the question.
More specifically on the topic we had today, which is the coverage of war crimes itself, because in a sense there's a situation of which we discussed of covering the war crime and the war crimes and justice processes. And again, maybe that comes back to what you talked about, a sense of realism. Justice and accountability is so important for Ukraine for now and especially for the future and in the long term, but it's going to be a long-term process. It is going to be frustrating. It is not going to be perfect by any means. There will be compromises in the structures of the courts, in the setup of the courts, in the way the cases are brought or can be brought. There's challenges of resources, challenges of evidence, challenges of getting defendants. The whole situation is very complex. So our objective with this project is to really help and support Ukrainians in particular to report in detail and in depth. Any Ukrainian may have an emotional response, a very powerful emotional response to the extent of war crimes which you mentioned and to what you see on your screens and what you've experienced in your lives. But justice has to be dispassionate. And that's a really difficult, let's say, conflict between what you feel in your heart and what you know in your head must be required for Ukraine to achieve moving forward. This is not taking sides. This is not making any equivalency. It's just saying justice. We know what it has to be. So our job in this project is really to support the expertise and the dispassionate coverage so that the results as they come over time can be accepted and understood in the context that's going to be realistic as they evolve.
У нас уже є перші.
We already have the first trials, even the first sentences with the occupiers that have been accused of war crimes. Very recently, there was a commander of a Russian tank that hit a civilian object, a residential building, was sentenced. I would not say that this has become a big story in the news, but it was on the news. Are there recommendations for journalists or for the media? Where do you find that balance between your civic stance, your human outrage on the one hand, the rage, the anger, and on the other hand, the professional responsibility to cover these news professionally. I'll start perhaps because this is really a very difficult subject, and finding the balance of where you end as a citizen of Ukraine who cannot be calm about what's happening and is not required to, and the professional things. But it's there, and the job of the journalist and of journalism is to cover the processes professionally and neutrally, to keep them in focus, because it's really important that they do not leave the information sphere. We have to talk about this systemically, because we know many cases when journalists, when they find themselves on the front line and when they would do publications that would then be blocked on social media because this was marked as hate speech. We know many instances when photographs from Bucha or Irpin were also banned and removed on social media because there was excessive violence, obviously. But it is reality, and this balance for people who never faced the situation of war can be traumatic, can be a traumatic experience, but it has to be covered. Things have to be, you have to call things by their names. Russians are Russians. The Russian Federation is a terrorist country, not orcs, not other things, obviously, because orcs, you can't sue an orc, and these things are extremely important. Ruslan, do you see a material for future international tribunals and international legal processes, proceedings about war crimes in Ukraine? The material for war crimes is there. The question is who will make those decisions, and the question is how will these decisions be enforced? Because the International Criminal Court today, they cannot view the entire block. They cannot try the entire block of crimes, considering that the attorney's office of the International Criminal Court is documenting the fact. The problem is also that the UN that we can count on is essentially blocked today, precisely by the presence of the Russian Federation in the Security Council. And so the format of any tribunal that will make decisions on the Russian Federation war crimes against Ukraine, that is a question for the future. Maybe I'll ask a broader question. What ways do you see? What paths do you see to seeing that the war criminals see justice? Well, there are several options suggested, and probably in discussions between international lawyers and advocates and journalists, we're probably going to see a hybrid international court that will bring together, on the one hand, the national jurisdiction, and on the other hand, international jurisdiction. But the format in which this will all take place is still a question for discussion, still an open question. Still, there still remains the question of what we do with this decision of the International Tribunal after the decision is made. After the ruling is made, if the Russian Federation remains unpunished, we can forget about the future of the international law in the format as it was known to us hitherto. International law will be meaningless.
Appeal to your experience, and from your experience in different countries, is there anything relevant for Ukraine? Do you have any suggestions for Ukrainians who are now in the job of reporting the war crimes? Do you see any legal suggestions how to deal with this?
Yes, thank you. It's really remarkable to address this topic here in Lviv. As you know, quite remarkably, two of the gentlemen who in fact authored key terms and terminologies that relate to international humanitarian law, crimes against humanity and genocide, actually studied at the Law University just down the street here in the earlier phase before the Second World War. So you have a remarkable history here that arises from the intellectual firmament of Lviv, but it also, of course, arrives from a territory which has suffered too much, experienced too much war, and that's really why the whole concept of international law in a certain way generates from Ukraine and indeed even Lviv. And it probably will be no great comfort to say to Ukrainians that this is a really grave challenge, as you outlined. I know your dire warning that international law will have no meaning, and it must feel like that, but something will emerge from this, and remarkably, the majority of the work will in fact be done by Ukrainians. It's a remarkable thing to imagine after all of this century has passed, the next phase of international law and the development of both its institutions and its precedents is going to be determined again here on this territory. It's such a profound reality. It must bring you with a lot of humility. I would be the last person to try to give any recommendations except to say that the process is long, and we have seen in the Balkans that there are frustrations and there are successes. And they don't come exactly quickly, and they don't come exactly in the way that you would like. But the international tribunals that were established for, the tribunal that was established for Yugoslavia did bring in a salutary effect to the society in a very significant way, both politically and underlying, and yet at the same time, many criminals were not charged and continue to walk free on the streets. And you're going to get, like I said, important results and frustrating non-results as well. And it is good to see it in the long term, but I think you will see really important principles and institutions grow from this conflict. So it will be something that Ukraine will invest in, contribute to, and I hope ultimately be proud of. The reporting and the journalism on that only makes it more important to do it in a professional, dispassionate way, because really we need good justice and good justice solutions arising from the tragedies that we see every day on our screens here.
Well, it looks like here in journalism there will be a demand for those individuals who have studied the Milosevic trial and the other experience from the Balkans. Do you have any suggestions or any lessons learned from the Balkans and from the tribunals dealing with the Balkans? Do you have any suggestions for Ukrainian media community and for individual journalists?
That would give me an opportunity to say that in our edition this week, we're very proud that one of our colleagues who covered the Yugoslav tribunals for a very long time wrote a piece precisely on this, comparing and taking some lessons learned. Next week we'll also aim to bring one of the leading prosecutors from the ICTY, so Jeffrey Knights, to Ukraine, and we hope you may host him for a conversation exactly on this topic. What we really want to underline is that it is a long-term and forensic task. Trial coverage can be boring, it can go on for a long time, but it is the procedural sifting through information and law which comes to the result and the solution in the case. Even in the very first case that we have had here of the young Russian soldier and his confession, the case itself has been analyzed. The solution to that case has been questioned. This is not to be challenging the guilt or innocence in the broader sense of Ukraine and Russia and the war. It's one case, however, and it must be looked at again legally and technically. And I think it is to Ukraine's benefit and to the Ukraine journalism community that all effort on these courts is tested and held accountable and be as robust as possible. So I think it's Ukraine wants a balanced and good justice as well as the world. And that means, again, putting your head and your heart somehow a little bit separated as a Ukrainian journalist, because it is really important that all justice is done and seen to be done as well as possible.
I will leave the next question open for answers from any of you. How different is the war that we are witnessing here in Ukraine from other armed conflicts that we have dealt with internationally, globally in the recent years or decades? What are the biggest differences, aside of the scale and the geographical scope?
Well, to put it briefly, perhaps the biggest difference is that the war is still ongoing. And in these conditions, we have to cover this situation, we have to work, and this is perhaps the most difficult conditions for journalists to work in. Secondly, we know that 34 journalists have died, have been killed. The Geneva Convention is constantly disregarded by the Russian Federation. The work of the journalists is extremely difficult, but even in these conditions, they provide coverage of the necessary information. As far as differences are concerned, yes, it really is very important to work without prejudice in conditions when, on the other hand, on the other side, we have this powerful information war on behalf of the Russian Federation, which is working. We cannot say that there is an other side to the story, that there's independent Russian journalism. There is disinformation, And in these conditions, that also makes it difficult because we can't turn to the full story, right? So it's very important for the journalist to illuminate, to cover every case, every situation, show the transparency of this process, because matters not only for Ukraine, this matters for the international community, including the professional community. As far as the security of journalists, yes, this war is extremely tragic. Some of those who have died, I were my friends. For instance, Max Levin in Levy Bereg, and it's understood to me why Russians are killing journalists, because they're witnesses to their crimes, who make camera films of this online, and which will then be used as the basis for trials. The most people this year in the world have died in Ukraine. I think Mexico comes second with about 15, with the constant cartels war. So these two countries, Ukraine and Mexico, have allowed the international organization Press Emblem Campaign. This is an advisory organization with the UN, to come up with the initiative to strengthen the liability for crimes against journalists in international law. Unfortunately, journalists right now don't have any kind of special status in war, in hostilities. They're equal to non-combatants, so they're not supposed to be taken captive. They're not supposed to be taken prisoner. They're supposed to be treated as ordinary civilians. And all of this marking that journalists do on the roofs of their cars or on their vests, it works only when the other side is not trying to kill a journalist or kill a witness. In our case, journalists are often forced to hide this marking so as not to become a target for the enemy.
Question touches on a really important point, which is, why is this war different? I was on a seminar just yesterday with journalists from the Middle East talking about Ukraine, and I have to say it was a little alarming, because viewpoints in Europe and America about Ukraine are one thing, but in Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East, they might be quite different. Their experience is different because of their feelings of conflict and their own experience of conflict. So they view this through a political prism and Western hypocrisy, to put it very directly. And it can be quite disorienting to understand that. But there's a reason why Ukraine is such an important war, and why it seemed to be so alarming, because it is a state invasion of a neighboring state as part of what appears to be a coordinated campaign by Russia over years to take over different parts of different territories surrounding. So many states have been civil wars, wars of liberation. Even the U.S., very controversial in Iraq, was a regime change, but U.S. was not trying to incorporate Iraq into its own territory, and so forth. So we have not seen this thing before, which is a major state such as Russia invading to take over another country. This is something unique, and to carve off territory. And I think that, combined with its regional implications, Moldova, Georgia, so on and so forth, this is really why it's been so alarming, and that's why it rises to such a level of importance. But it is important, again, for us to realize that people in other parts of the world come from different conflict backgrounds, and they have different reactions. Again, telling the story dispassionately, telling the story honestly, and giving them confidence that your reporting is as honestly and truthful as it can be, is the best way to try to address this disinformation challenge that you outlined.
And this is why Ukraine has initiated the forming of the International Tribunal on the fact of Russian aggression, which would focus on the political leadership of the Russian Federation, separately from the war crimes that may be viewed by other legal proceedings and other tribunals. This is the initiative that has already been on the news, and which will have to be covered by Ukrainian journalists and international journalists. Are there other observations? Yes. If we're talking about journalism, we have to see that apart from professional journalists, We also have many bloggers. We have many testimony from people recorded by unprofessional journalists, advocates, bloggers, activists. People want to convey that war crimes have taken place, how they have taken place, and it's this aspect when, from the moment the crime has been committed to the moment that people want to tell the world and are able to tell the world, that is the difference that sets this present war, from conflicts uh, that we discussed previously. And if you know such events, if you want to convey them to to international courts, record these videos, record this testimony, find those who collect this testimony. Thank you. I wanted to ask your opinion on the recent scandal with the report of Amnesty International. Um, I won't retell the whole narrative, but what is your opinion on this situation? I would take a slightly broader view. Generally, big international organizations have found themselves unprepared to these wars. I'll come back to Amnesty, sure, but just to see the context. Um, with the start of the full-scale invasion, it turned out that the large humanitarian organizations that ought to help Ukrainians, such as the Red Cross, Amnesty, and others, didn't have enough personnel in Ukraine, didn't have enough funds in their accounts, and even if they were gathering these funds, there would be questions on how to get these funds into Ukraine, how to disperse them here, how to hire personnel, and perhaps for the first 3 months, the Ukrainian non-governmental sector and the more flexible international organizations such as IWPR were the first responders, and the new initiatives arose. Over 1,500 new initiatives arose that have helped the IDPs and supported the military and tried to close the gaps. Obviously, the army expanded significantly, and there was not enough provisions. It was only 3 months down the road that we saw some greater impact of international organizations. What was this impact? Well, we've heard the criticism of the Red Cross, particularly the Russian branch, which started working in the filtration camps where Ukrainians were taken, and this this lack of systemic approach from an international organization that declares its neutrality was a shock to many. When they would take Romanian water to Dnipro, which doesn't lack water, which has no water shortages, and they would say they would talk about logistical problems. And of course, the report of the Amnesty International, in my opinion, it is tendentious. In my opinion, it is non-impartial. As far as I know, it was prepared without involving local personnel, which is weird because who ought to know the details if not the local personnel, local staff, and also the presentation was not neutral. And we see now the response not only of the Ukrainian office. You know that the head of the Ukrainian office has resigned in protest, but I've seen that I think the Swiss employee of Amnesty is also quitting. So there's a response in the world, and we see how Amnesty International is losing support of its donors and is facing the problem of losing charity donations. Reputation has to take first place for international organizations. In my opinion, it was not worth. They should not have played. They should not have speculated on the subject of war when there are war crimes being perpetrated. Uh, it was not. It was unwise. I don't know. It was unwise perhaps to stress that the military are placed in schools in summer when the schools are not open, and that this somehow endangers children, which, I mean, just this thesis itself is really weird. It was really weird that it was put in the headline. also in international press, which leaves us with the thought that war crimes can be told, can be covered in different ways and documented in different ways. I wanted to ask Anthony
to call your fellow colleagues from London and say, guys, you might be taking this into a wrong direction.
Well, I think you mentioned football. You like football. You know the Goalkeepers Union there, but for the grace. I do have a certain amount of humility because all charity directors and executives can make mistakes. So I have to say I approach it in some confidence that way. And I think the controversy is obviously quite well known and explosive, and we've covered it too. Really important to note that the report was a press release, not a report, that the feedback from the Ukrainian authorities was not in time to be incorporated. If you're doing such a sensitive report, you maybe take some care there. I would like to try something without being controversial to say that the question is a valuable one. The way it was answered and addressed and presented and written was not helpful. So I think anybody, and this may go to the broader question, we're saying, it's actually really an important question. Is the Ukrainian military engaging with civilian territories in the best way possible? I know that Ukrainians would like the answer to that question. I know the Ukrainian military actually would appreciate oversight, thoughts, constructive oversight on that question. It's an interesting question because I know how much concern Ukrainians have for their population. But to do it in this explosive and public way with the oversight of equality and law, that's sort of not really, anyway, it hasn't worked. So I would like to make that sort of desegregation. It may look against the way the courts and judicial system may be a benefit to us. I think any Ukrainian would like these questions thought through. Oh, that's a good question to think about. Are we doing as well as we can do? Right, but don't go around loosely in a press release accusing us of breaking the law when we haven't had a discussion. So some kind of outline there. I did want to say something that you mentioned, Andrii, if you don't mind. It's a little bit off the case, but of the timing, because many times I come in briefly to I come into Ukraine, walking from the Medica, across the Medica border, and it's very bittersweet because now you see the most beautiful tent from UNHCR. Beautiful. And I had lots of emotions last night when I walked through because, of course, all of the village of support is gone because the flow of refugees is not there. But the tent is there empty. And when I was there in February and March, it was bitterly cold, and there were so many people, and Ukrainian authorities were having such a challenge themselves to deal with it. We know there were some racial concerns and all these issues. It was such a hard time, and there was no tents. Now that the weather's turned and there's no refugees, we have the most beautiful tents. And I think that is also something as an international community and support organizations, are we able to move fast enough and think through the inevitable consequences that we can be prepared in time? So I think about those empty tents.
Olga?
Я б хотіла додати, що дійсно
I wanted to add that, yeah, the situation with Amnesty International is very indicative. It says how sensitive these questions are, particularly during the war, during an ongoing conflict. It demonstrates the double standards. It demonstrates that double standards are inadmissible in this period. This is actually a positive case for me because all the other organizations will see how this kind of playing at diplomacy with the terrorist state can really hurt your reputation as an organization. Just a quick remark to add here. The question is that the name of the report and the report itself, they're different, right? And then the second question that we discussed in the beginning is that not taking into account the position of the local team leads to reputation losses and a lack of responsibility for the words that you say, for what you say. How are war crimes documented now? There are several levels. The information that Ukrainian law enforcement bodies collect, the security service, the attorney's office, prosecutor's office, the level of international organizations. We can think of the UN Commission represented in Ukraine. However, the extent of war crimes is such that we need to have a sense of the scale of how many war crimes and what kinds of war crimes have been perpetrated, so that we don't miss what has been perpetrated but not documented. And so both the journalists and activists, first of all, they fix based on what the journalists have, open source information, but also what is published in the state service for emergencies, what is published in the local media, and what is published by the local administrations, and what is seen locally. Because often media do not report specific information about what happened where. And this is the question that on the one hand, we hide the information from Russia, but on the other hand, we ourselves can't know what happened because the information is too general. And that's the question. If we come back to the work of the Institute for War and Peace Reporting, what geography are you focused on? Are the regions that ought to be prioritized right now?
One of the grave problems that we have on information and investigations, which it is not possible to work on the currently occupied territories, those that were previously or those that have are currently with fighting. So that certainly limits and is really the gravest challenge. And I think it's, as Ukrainians will know well more than I do, war crimes are continuing every day in these territories. So whatever may have happened in Bucha and Irpin and Hostomel is continuing elsewhere in territories where we do not have eyesight. And so that's an ongoing and really draining tragedy. But otherwise, we are really working across the country in every territory where we can. We're working through local teams, we're working through our hired staff, and we're also working on a specific project with a network of investigators and human rights groups in a really exciting project called Reckoning, Ukraine Testifies. And this is to strengthen journalists and others in their storytelling. One of the really important points is so that journalism in their work do not undermine the judicial reliability of information, disturbing evidence, or taking your filming in a way that can be useful. So these are all kinds of trainings and technical aspects that we can contribute to, and also doing long-form investigative work that also can provide rich material in a more useful way for judicial processes. So across the country, in as much as we're able to.
As editor, I'm also responsible for soliciting text from authors, and so I see the changes in focus of the editors board and the interest in the readership. Basically, the reader's interest is moving beyond contact lines. So when there were events in the Kyiv region, we write more about the Kyiv region. So basically, the interest follows the contact line. Now that we're awaiting attack in the Kherson region, Ukrainian offense in the Kherson region, obviously all the attention is there. Additionally, we have authors who work in occupied territories. Of course, they cannot write under their names. Their materials are published anonymously, but we have authors in Berdyansk, in Kherson, in Enerhodar, in Crimea. So all of the events that happen in occupied territories are also in our focus, and we will continue to write, to cover, while preserving all anonymity and security of our authors. And I might add that in addition to the tragic cases of journalists dying, there are dozens or perhaps hundreds cases when journalists were kidnapped, tortured, blackmailed, intimidated, and this is a daily routine practice in the work of the Russian occupiers in occupied territories. Well, yes, one such journalist from Novakakhovka, Oleg Baturin, is a constant author. He spent, he was in a jail in Kherson for 8 days in a Russian prison. He was pressured psychologically, physically. Fortunately, he managed to get out alive and get his family out, and he continues writing for us. We await a big long article supposed to come out about Kherson collaborators, traitors who switched over to the side of the occupiers.
I was going to add just a real shout out to Ukrainian journalism. Obviously, you mentioned many international journalists here, and I think what we learned from this experience so far is the importance of cooperation. You need the international journalists to bring resources, to bring a little focus, the energy sometimes, and of course their excellence in presentation and formulation, and their dispassionate balance sometimes. But you absolutely need the Ukrainian journalists with the language skills, the knowledge, the base, the how to get around. And there's simply no story that will be done in this territory is done by an international journalist alone. So everything is cooperative, and everything is drawing from this incredible well of Ukrainian talent. So I think there's, despite all the tragedies you're facing, there's a great pride for Ukrainian journalism and what it's doing to tell this story, and really should be recognized.
Останнє запитання буде.
Last question will be for you all. When you are asked of how you remember these 5 months, what sticks in your mind, what picture, what impression, what episode will stick in your mind? And I'll perhaps start with you, Andrii. So I think, firstly, the constant work, no days off, especially the first few weeks or months, when you wake up and you work, and then you fall asleep and you work, and then you work in your dreams. And this was the energy, the adrenaline, the hatred really fueled us to continue in that mode. But secondly, for myself, I just rediscovered Ukraine for myself. I have fallen in love with the Kherson region, fallen in love with the people in Kherson who came out with Ukrainian flags. I have traveled all over the Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk regions. I've seen our sunflower fields. I've spoken to our people, and you know this picture when people at the checkpoint, rather than simply show you their passport, they give you cold water to our soldiers. That was a new revelation for me with regard to Ukraine and Ukrainians. Ruslan, do you have an episode that you can't forget that sticks in your mind? Yes, it's an underground crossing at a train station in Lviv. There's a massive number of women and children in line to be evacuated, and a completely full railway station. And I would like to point out that the work of the volunteers who were helping people leave. Olga, I agree with Andrii. What characterizes these 5 months is the lack of, days and weeks and dates. You have a job to do, so you do it. Sometimes it's hard to say what day it is or what day in the calendar it is. But as for, I remember I spent almost four months on the contact line with the Norwegian teams, and the smiles and the hugs and the hot tea and the checkpoints.
That you will take back home?
So many the challenges, to be brief. The sound of the siren in the morning of the 24th in Lviv was so dramatic, I'll never forget it. The images in the suburbs around Kyiv after the clearance of the Russians, and seeing bodies and seeing all that will never be forgotten. Going around so many destroyed buildings in Kharkiv, the Chernobyl villages, so many places, it accumulates. And the trauma of these evacuation trains, I took several of them, and seeing so many people crushed and struggling with children and the mothers, these are images that just stay with you. But the real thing I'll take away from this is the social cohesion of the Ukrainian country together. It really is not related to politics or the state. It's survival, it's the people, the civil society, what they can do, the volunteers and the military to defend themselves. This is something really you have to hark back almost to the Second World War that somebody in Britain or America, Europe would begin to even contact with, and it's a trauma that the country has to go through, but it's an amazing thing to witness and see how this country is pulling together to defend itself.
Ruslan Topolevskyi, Anthony Borden.
Ruslan Topolevskyi, Anthony Borden, Olga Guzhva, Andrii Yanitskiy, and this has been a conversation about Ukraine, the media, war crimes, and their coverage and documentation. I am very grateful to you for this conversation. Thank you for the information you shared with us. stand with Ukraine.